Somewhere in a storage drawer in Copenhagen, a fragment of a child's tooth sat wrapped and labeled for nearly 7 decades before anyone realized what it actually held. It had crossed an ocean, survived 2 world wars worth of museum reorganizations, and been cataloged alongside thousands of other bone fragments pulled from a remote Alaskan cave. Nobody flagged it as special. Nobody guessed that inside that tiny sliver of enamel was a genetic record capable of rewriting one of the oldest and most confidently taught stories in American history. When scientists finally tested it decades later, the results didn't just add a new detail to the timeline of how humans reached the Americas. They opened up a question nobody had thought to ask. What if an entire population of people lived, hunted, raised children, and vanished from the historical record so completely that even their descendants never knew they had existed? The story of that tooth begins in 1949, when archaeological work brought researchers to a windswept stretch of limestone cliffs on Alaska's Seward Peninsula, overlooking a body of water known as the Unearthed Basin. The dig produced an enormous haul of material, thousands of animal bones, broken tools, and fragments of everyday life left behind by people who had occupied the caves thousands of years earlier. Buried in that pile was a single tooth from a child who couldn't have been much older than a toddler. At the time, there was no way to extract meaningful information from it. Genetic sequencing as a science hadn't been invented yet, and the tools available in the late 1940s could barely establish rough ages for organic material, let alone read the genetic code locked inside a fragment of enamel. So the tooth was packed up, shipped off, and quietly filed away in a museum collection, where it would remain untouched for close to 70 years. During those 70 years, entire branches of science emerged that would have seemed like science fiction to the researchers digging in that cave. The ability to pull usable DNA out of ancient remains, refine it, and compare against modern populations transformed archaeology from a discipline built mainly on stone tools and soil layers into one that could read the actual genetic history written into old bone. When researchers eventually went back through Arctic collections looking for specimens that might benefit from these new techniques, that overlooked tooth resurfaced. Most people assumed testing. It would simply confirm what many already believed, that the ancient people of Alaska were closely related to the ancestors of today's indigenous populations across the Americas. Instead, the genetic profile that came back didn't fit cleanly into any known group. It wasn't a close match to modern Native American populations, and it wasn't a close match to ancient Siberian populations either. It sat apart, as though an entire branch of the human family tree had been growing quietly on its own for thousands of years, unnoticed by anyone. To understand how a whole population could slip through the cracks of history like that, it helps to picture what the region actually looked like when that child was alive. During the height of the last ice age, so much of the planet's water was locked away inside massive continental ice sheets that global sea levels dropped by hundreds of feet. That drop exposed a huge stretch of what is now ocean floor between Siberia and Alaska, revealing a landmass that scientists now refer to as Beringia. For generations, the popular image of this region was a narrow, icy walkway, something people picture as a thin strip of land that desperate hunters dashed across while chasing migrating herds. That picture turns out to be almost entirely wrong. Beringia wasn't a bridge at all. It was a vast, stable region, roughly the size of a small continent, and instead of being a frozen, empty wasteland, it supported a surprisingly productive grassland ecosystem that researchers called a mammoth steppe. Herds of woolly mammoths, wild horses, and other grazing animals moved across it, sustained by meltwater running down from mountain glaciers and soil rich enough to support a full, functioning food web. The people who settled there weren't passing through on some desperate one-way trip toward a new continent. They were living full, settled lives on a real homeland, one that has since disappeared entirely beneath the waves of the modern Bering Strait. As the planet warmed and the great ice sheets began to melt, sea levels rose to reclaim the land that had been exposed for thousands of years. This didn't happen suddenly. Over the course of centuries, rising water swallowed river valleys, hunting grounds, and low-lying settlements that generations of families had called home. Peninsulas became islands. Familiar landmarks disappeared beneath the tide, and the population that had once spread across the interior of this vanished world was gradually pushed toward higher, drier ground. The cave complex, where researchers found that child's tooth sat on high rocky terrain, on what had once been the eastern edge of this now-drowned homeland. The people using those caves weren't wanderers passing through en route to somewhere new. They had built an entire life on that land, with no reason to suspect it would ever slip away beneath the ocean. The caves themselves preserved an extraordinarily detailed record of how people survived there. Cut into limestone hills above the Muric Basin, they offered real shelter from brutal Arctic winds. And because the region sits on permafrost, the ground inside stayed frozen for most of the year, functioning almost like a natural freezer. That constant cold is exactly why so much organic material managed to survive intact instead of decomposing over millennia. When researchers sifted through the cave floors, they found bison and caribou bones bearing clear-cut marks and fracture patterns left behind by stone tools, direct evidence that animals had been butchered and processed inside the shelter. Alongside those bones, they uncovered a sophisticated toolkit. Tiny, razor-sharp stone microblades designed to be set into spear points and knives, along with composite weapons built from antler and bone capable of bringing down large animals. Layers of sediment inside the cave suggest they serve more than one purpose over the seasons, functioning as a lookout point during warmer months when hunters could track herds crossing the open plains, and as a refuge during the fierce storms that swept through in winter. More precise radiocarbon testing on a set of antler projectile points recovered from the site eventually placed human activity. They're at roughly 11,000 years old, right around the time the Ice Age was ending, and this ancient landmass was beginning to vanish beneath rising water for good. For most of the 20th century, none of this fit comfortably into the story that mainstream archaeology had settled on. For decades, the field was dominated by a framework known as the Clovis First Model, named after a site near Clovis, New Mexico, where researchers in the 1930s uncovered beautifully crafted stone spear points with a distinctive fluted base. Once radiocarbon dating became widely available, those points were shown to be roughly 13,000 years old, and a clean, simple narrative quickly took hold across classrooms and textbooks. According to that model, a single wave of big game hunters crossed from Siberia into Alaska around 13,000 years ago, found a route through retreating glaciers, and spread across the entire Western Hemisphere within a few centuries. It was tidy, easy to teach, and easy to defend, and for a long stretch of time it functioned less like an open scientific question and more like settled fact. Researchers who reported evidence suggesting an older human presence in the Americas often ran into serious pushback. Their methods were picked apart, their funding was questioned, and in some cases their careers suffered simply for challenging a framework that had become deeply entrenched in academic culture. But physical evidence has a way of accumulating whether or not it fits the accepted story. One of the earliest and most significant challenges came from a site called Monte Verde in southern Chile, where an archaeologist spent years uncovering the remains of ancient huts, wooden tools, and preserved plant material. The findings pointed to human habitation roughly 14,500 years ago, near the southern tip of South America. If the Clovis First Model were correct, and people had only reached Alaska around 13,000 years ago, there simply wouldn't have been enough time for anyone to travel the length of 2 continents and build a settled community that far south. The discovery triggered years of intense debate, with skeptics traveling to the site to challenge the dating methods directly. In the end, the evidence held up, and Monte Verde became one of the first major cracks in a theory that had gone almost unquestioned for generations. Once that door opened, other evidence that had been quietly waiting for years began to resurface. A rock shelter in Pennsylvania produced a long, well-preserved sequence of stone tools and fire pits pointing to human activity stretching back much further than the old timeline allowed. In Texas, researchers digging beneath the expected Clovis layer at another site found a distinct set of older stone tools, dated to roughly 15,000 years ago, in the very region where Clovis culture was supposed to have originated in the first place. Piece by piece, the physical record made it increasingly difficult to defend the idea that human history in the Americas began with a single, tidy wave of migration 13,000 years ago. But even as archaeologists argued over stone tools and soil layers, the discovery that would truly upend the field wasn't going to come from a shovel. It was going to come from genetic material, recovered from the remains of 2 infants, buried together deep in the interior of Alaska. That site sits in the Tanana River Valley, far from the coastal caves where the original tooth had been found decades earlier. Archaeological work there uncovered the cremated remains of a young child in one layer of the site, and then In an earlier layer beneath it, something even more striking, an undisturbed burial containing the remains of two infant girls. The care taken in that burial says a great deal about how these children were regarded by their community. Both infants have been covered in a bright red mineral pigment traditionally used in ceremonial burials by ancient peoples across the world, and they were laid to rest together with grave goods that included decorated antler rods, stone dart points, and work stone tools, likely parts of hunting weapons placed there with clear intention. Genetic testing later suggested the two infants were closely related, possibly cousins. Local indigenous communities eventually gave them names of their own, and researchers refer to the older of the pair by a scientific designation, an infant who lived only a matter of weeks before she died. Because bone preservation at the site was exceptional, samples were sent to an international team of geneticists for analysis, and from those remains, researchers managed to recover a complete, high-quality genome. When that genetic data was published, it reshaped the entire conversation around how the Americas were first populated. The DNA didn't cleanly align with modern Native American populations, and it didn't match ancient Siberian populations either. It represented a separate, previously unknown branch of the human family tree, one that had split off from other populations tens of thousands of years earlier, and then existed largely on its own for a long stretch of time. Researchers gave this newly identified group a name, describing them as a distinct ancient population that geneticists sometimes call a ghost population, meaning a group that lived successfully for a very long time and then disappeared without leaving an obvious, direct genetic legacy among people alive today. The site also revealed something else worth noting: evidence of some of the earliest known salmon use anywhere in the ancient Americas, suggesting these communities relied on a broad and resourceful diet rather than surviving purely off big-game hunting. This is where the story circles back to that small tooth found decades earlier on the coast. When researchers finally sequenced DNA recovered from it, they compared the results directly against the genome from the Tanana Valley infants, and the two matched. Despite the sites being separated by hundreds of kilometers, both the coastal child and the interior infants belonged to the same ancient population. That match mattered enormously, because it proved this wasn't some tiny, isolated family group that happened to leave behind one unusual genetic sample. It was evidence of a real, geographically widespread population that held on to a distinct genetic identity across a huge span of land and time, surviving major environmental upheaval along the way. Later archaeological evidence suggests that ancestors of present-day Athabascan-speaking peoples eventually expanded into the region several thousand years afterward, gradually absorbing or replacing what remained of this earlier population. This discovery lined up neatly with a theory that had already been circulating among researchers for years, known as the Beringian standstill hypothesis. The idea suggests that the ancestors of Native Americans didn't simply pass through Alaska on a quick journey south. Instead, they became geographically trapped in this now-vanished region for an extraordinarily long stretch of time. To the west, the harsh, dry climate of Ice Age Siberia made sustained travel back and forth increasingly difficult. To the east, massive ice sheets cover much of what is now Canada form an impassable wall, blocking any route further into North America. People were effectively boxing at the top of the world, and genetic evidence suggests this isolation may have lasted for thousands of years, long enough for a genetically distinct population to take shape entirely on its own, cut off from both of its potential neighbors. Eventually, as the planet warmed and the glacier began to retreat, a path opened, but not the one older textbooks described. For years, the accepted theory held that early Americans traveled south through an inland corridor that opened up as glaciers over Canada melted apart in the middle. But more recent geological research suggests that corridor was a frozen, muddy, and largely inhospitable landscape, incapable of supporting human life until long after such a migration would have needed to happen. Instead, growing evidence points toward a coastal route, where people skilled in boat travel move along the edges of retreating glaciers by sea, following a rich and productive marine ecosystem that stretched almost continuously along the coastline from Asia down to the Americas. Traveling this way would have given people access to a stable, abundant food source the entire journey, without needing to adapt to dramatically different environments at every stage. It also helps explain why so little direct evidence of this migration has ever been found, since rising sea levels have since buried most of that ancient coastline deep underwater. Adding even more complexity to the picture, genetic studies of certain indigenous populations deep in the Amazon rainforest have revealed a faint but real genetic connection to ancient populations from Australia, New Guinea, and the surrounding Pacific region, a signal almost entirely absent elsewhere across the Americas. That absence raises an intriguing possibility that more than one distinct population may have contributed to the peopling of the continent, arriving through pathways that scientists still haven't fully mapped out. The most recent piece of evidence to challenge the old timeline came from a desert basin in New Mexico, where researchers uncovered fossilized human footprints preserved in the sediment of an ancient lake bed. Dating work on those footprints has been debated and refined over several years by multiple independent teams using different methods, and current estimates place them somewhere in a range stretching back over 17,000 years, with some findings suggesting an even older date. Even at the more conservative end of that range, the footprints demonstrate that people were present deep in North America well before any inland corridor could have opened, and long before the old single migration model ever allowed for their existence. What all of this adds up to is a story far richer and far messier than the simple picture of one group crossing a narrow bridge that dominated classrooms for most of the last century. The real history of the Americas appears to include an entire homeland that vanished beneath rising oceans, a population that thrived there for thousands of years before disappearing from the direct genetic record, and migration routes that likely ran along ancient coastlines rather than through the interior of the continent. It's a story pieced together not from one dramatic find, but from decades of quiet, patient work. A tooth in a museum drawer, 2 infants buried with evident care in the Alaskan interior, footprints pressed into ancient mud, and genetic data extracted from bones that had waited thousands of years to be understood. Each new discovery has forced researchers to reconsider what they thought they already knew, and there's little reason to believe the story is finished. Somewhere in a storage box, a forgotten collection, or an unexcavated layer of earth, there may be more evidence waiting for the right combination of technology, patience, and curiosity to finally bring it into the light.